before the indictments, before the federal task forces, before the turf wars that would define the East Coast, there was only a handful of men and a decision. The year was 1957. America was thriving. Suburbs stretched outward from city centers. Televisions flickered in living rooms. Factories roared. Families posed for photographs in freshly built neighborhoods. The war was over, but not everyone adjusted to peace. After World War II, thousands of young men came home carrying something heavier than duffel bags. Structure had defined their lives. Brotherhood had defined their identity. Adrenaline had defined their days. Civilian life felt smaller. Across the United States, motorcycle clubs began forming. Some were harmless riding associations. Some were social clubs. And some were something else entirely. In 1947, a riot involving motorcyclists in Hollister, California, later dramatized and mythologized, ignited national headlines. In the aftermath, the American Motorcycle Association reportedly stated that 99% of motorcyclists were law-abiding citizens, which left 1%. It wasn't meant as a challenge, but some riders took it as one. If 99% followed the rules, the other 1% didn't. And across America, that identity began to solidify. On the West Coast, clubs formed beneath the California sun. Groups like the Hells Angels would eventually dominate headlines and mythology. But something different was happening thousands of miles away. Not in Hollywood. Not in Los Angeles. In Prince George's County, Maryland. And in 1957, the Pagans Motorcycle Club was born. They didn't choose skulls. They didn't choose angels. They chose fire, specifically imagery inspired by Norse mythology. Their emblem centered on Surtur, the fire giant from ancient myth, a figure said to rise at Ragnarok and set the world ablaze. Why Norse symbolism? Because it felt ancient, pre-Christian, unapologetic, untamed. It wasn't polished Americana. It was something older, something destructive, something inevitable. The patch was not decoration. It was declaration. And once you earned it, you didn't take it off. In the early days, the pagans were small, local, structured. This was not a random gathering of riders. This was an organization forming itself carefully. Philosophy alone doesn't build a club. Structure does. To join, you didn't simply sign up. You prospected. You proved yourself. You absorbed the culture before you were allowed to represent it. Inside the club, hierarchy mattered. Prospect, full patch member, sergeant at arms, president. Every role carried weight. Every member answered to someone. Authority flowed downward. Loyalty flowed upward. This wasn't a weekend hobby. It was identity. Unlike some clubs that aggressively expanded coast to coast, the Pagans chose a different strategy. Consolidation. Maryland, Delaware, Pennsylvania, New Jersey. The East Coast was dense, compact, strategic. Territory in that corridor meant access, highways, ports, cities, industry. Territory meant influence. Influence meant power. They weren't chasing Hollywood mythology. They were building control. And control requires discipline. Outlaw motorcycle culture is territorial by nature. Patches represent geography. Geography represents authority. And authority does not tolerate competition. In the late 1950s, the Pagans were still in their quiet phase. Private gatherings, careful recruitment, but growth changes visibility, and visibility attracts attention. As decades passed, federal and state law enforcement agencies began focusing on outlaw motorcycle clubs nationwide. Racketeering statutes, conspiracy investigations, organized crime task forces. The East Coast was no exception. Over time, authorities would describe the Pagans as one of the more volatile of the major outlaw motorcycle clubs operating in the United States. But in the beginning, they were building quietly, and quiet foundations often last the longest. The appeal wasn't random chaos. It was belonging, a shared symbol, a shared code, a shared enemy, sometimes real, sometimes imagined. For men who felt disconnected from post-war suburban life, the club offered clarity. Rules were simple. Loyalty was absolute. Brotherhood was non-negotiable. And identity was visible, stitched in bold color across your back. The fire giant wasn't subtle. It wasn't meant to be. It symbolized destruction, yes, but also rebirth. Fire clears ground, and what grows afterward belongs to whoever controls the ashes. By the 1960s and 1970s, other outlaw motorcycle clubs were expanding beyond their original territories. The East Coast was becoming contested space. Rivalries were forming. Lines were being drawn. Motorcycle clubs weren't just social groups anymore. They were power structures embedded in regions. And when two power structures occupy the same geography, friction is inevitable. But in 1957, that future wasn't yet visible. There were no headlines, no multi-state investigations, just a group of riders choosing a symbol, choosing a structure, choosing each other. Patches matter. They represent earned status. And in outlaw culture, removing one without permission is unthinkable. The pagans built their identity around permanence. You don't casually join, and you don't casually leave. That permanence creates cohesion. Cohesion creates strength. Strength attracts attention, and attention invites conflict. Every empire begins quietly, not with a roar, but with agreement, a handshake, a code, a shared belief that the world outside doesn't understand you and doesn't need to. The pagans didn't start as a national force. They didn't begin with coast-to-coast ambition. They began with consolidation, with fire, with Norse myth stitched onto leather in Prince George's County. But symbols have gravity, and fire, by nature, spreads. As America changed, as cities expanded, as other clubs pushed eastward, the pagans would face pressures that tested their structure. Internal discipline, external scrutiny. The quiet garage meetings of 1957 would evolve into something larger, more organized, more visible, more dangerous, because once identity hardens into structure, and structure anchors into territory, it becomes very difficult to uproot. The Norse fire had been lit, and it was never meant to stay small. In the beginning, they were just riders, but on the East Coast, they were building an empire. Next episode, the rise of the East Coast Empire.